Okay. Um, that's definitely helpful. This is granted that this is hard to put a pin in exactly. It'd be useful to get your thoughts on how quickly that adoption cycle might take place. Are we talking sort of next 3 years versus next 10 years or longer?
Yeah, it's gonna take a lot. I mean, it's gonna be an augmentation. So, and I'll give you a perfect example of this. So you have 1,000 users in a police department. 1,000 users had 1,000 devices. On the refresh cycle, when they got new devices, they would get 1,000, 1-to-1, 1,000 new devices. Today, instead of getting 1,000, $5,000 handheld radios, they would get 700, and then augment with 300 smartphones with push to talk. Because again, the dog catcher doesn't need a high-end $5,000 radio. The code enforcer doesn't need it. The detectives don't need it. The fire marshals don't need it. All these different supporting services and secondary users don't need the $5,000 LMR type radio. So they'll be able to augment that service with a smartphone product with a push to talk button or push to talk service with an IP gateway that continues to talk into their existing mission critical communication system, but not, now they can do it with a $500 or $600 smartphone instead of a $5,000 or $6,000. So they're saving money, and that augmentation is going to take a bigger bite over time. Instead of 70% refresh on the higher end, it's going to go down. It will go down to 60%, and then maybe down to 50% eventually in a few years. Where now instead of 1,000, it'd be 500 mission critical devices will go to the first responder and the cops and the major firefighters, first line guys, and then 500 will be smartphone devices or feature phone devices with push to talk capabilities at a much lower price point, and they'll be able to augment that service. One, it frees up spectrum for public safety users that really need the spectrum. Two, it provides voice communications where it's needed in a non-mission critical environment. So again, parks and recreation, streets guys, all those guys can use push to talk over cellular just fine. They don't need a mission critical handheld device. So we're seeing that more and more. And so I think it will take some years for that percentage to continue to go up as FirstNet comes on board and everything else, and as users find new applications that become more and more critical to use in the field. But boy, that diehard mission critical voice solution, or I call it life critical communication, really is not going to be replaced for many, many years. It could take 10, 15 years. You'll see any kind of replacement of that technology.
Great. You mentioned FirstNet. We have a really sort of high-level understanding of what that is and what the impact is, but it would be helpful to get, if you would expand on that more as it relates to the sort of market for radios. Sure.
So FirstNet is basically two things. FirstNet is an entity. It's a government entity that's managed by the Department of Commerce and CTIA folks. And basically, it governs the direction and the openness of the spectrum. So FirstNet basically owns 20 megahertz of LTE spectrum in the 700 megahertz area. And what they've done is they went out to bid to find a private-public partnership and to the commercial carriers, and AT&T won that RFP. So AT&T now has the job to build out what they call Band 14, which is that 20 megahertz of spectrum, 10 megahertz upstream, 10 megahertz of downstream spectrum. AT&T has now taken that on. So now, and with that, they have a dedicated core, EPC core, basically evolved packet core, in a dedicated policy server and dedicated database for all the users of monitors. But they're also using additional AT&T spectrum today. So the spectrum you would use for your commercial cellular, the police department can actually use that as well, in addition to the new spectrum. And so when public safety is not using Band 14, AT&T is obviously using it for consumer use. So they're using the unknowns. But public safety has priority and preemption over any activity on the cellular network as long as they're on the FirstNet core. And so think of it again as a public-private partnership with AT&T, who's now selling what they call FirstNet service, which is different than the FirstNet, which is really a government agency kind of overseeing things with AT&T. But the AT&T service is this first responder service. So let's say a police department buys 100 smartphones. Instead of putting a standard AT&T SIM card in that smartphone, they will put a FirstNet SIM card in there. It still works on the AT&T spectrum. It still works in an additional band 14 spectrum. But now they actually can talk. They actually talk to their own server, and that own server gives them priority over consumers on the network. So if you're Fire Chief Smith, and Fire Chief Smith wants to get into a congested area and make a call or make some data communications across on his smartphone, then he's going to bump you or I as consumers on that same tower. He'll have priority on the tower. So that's how it works. AT&T gets 20 megahertz of spectrum utilized. You have to prioritize that 20 megahertz to public safety. First responders get a huge nationwide network in AT&T, and they get priority over consumers on network access. So when a catastrophe hits, hurricanes, whatever, they know they're going to get priority access over consumers.
Got it. Is the advantage there over sort of the radio systems that are currently in use primarily cost, or is it also a superior technology?
It's two different things, right? So the LMR systems over there are really voice, right? You push to talk, release to listen, you go to talk groups. It's really around voice communications, right? Where FirstNet is really around voice, data, and video, right? I can do everything on a FirstNet network with a smartphone. I can do data. I can do bookings. I can do mugshots. I can take pictures and images and send it back. I can take live video and send it back to dispatch during an event or some other traffic stop, whatever. I can connect it back into my body-worn camera and use it as LTE data service back into radio dispatch. So there's so much more I can do with a handheld computing tool than a standard LMR radio. LMR radio is simply just voice communications. That's my lifeline, voice communications. That, my gun, my baton, my handcuffs, whatever. That's my Batman belt. And then, of course, I have my smartphone on FirstNet. That's for my data connectivity and so forth.
Do you have a sense for what sort of percentage of law enforcement agencies nationally are on the system already?
I would probably say somewhere around maybe 5%, 10%, maybe tops, maybe probably it's definitely less than 10%.
Got it. And I'd imagine you're sort of using it in tandem with the systems they already have, at least in the early stages.
Right, and there are still a lot of agencies out there that are on Verizon that don't have coverage on the AT&T network. So AT&T won FirstNet. So imagine there's so many places in the state of Illinois, Pennsylvania, whatever, that have great Verizon coverage, but have little sparse AT&T coverage. So those agencies would love to get on FirstNet, but they wouldn't go on to FirstNet or slash AT&T if they didn't have coverage. So AT&T is working on filling those gaps, those coverage gaps they know exist. They know how they have to fill them for public safety, because if not, these police agencies will never jump off of Verizon onto FirstNet. They'll stay where they're at because of the coverage.
Got it. That's helpful. So it's sort of limited inherently by AT&T's coverage. Again, it'd be helpful to get a sense for how quickly you think adoption of FirstNet will ramp and then by extension take share from traditional radio communications. Is it sort of a 3-year timeline, 5, 10 years, just ballpark?
Yeah, I would say probably 10 years before. And it's never going to have 100% displace, LMR radios. There's too much of an investment by state, local agencies, counties that have invested, tens of millions of dollars in their communication systems. They'll keep them for years and years. But again, that augmentation percentage will continue to rise as more. It's a trust issue, right? If you're a cop and you've been using a portable radio, for 20 years in the beat, and all of a sudden somebody says, "Hey, give me a radio. I'm going to give you this smartphone," and you're going to go, "Huh? It's great for sending text and emails and SMS and taking pictures, but do I want to rely on the smartphone to save my life if I'm in danger?" We're not there yet. We're a ways away from any kind of mission critical push to talk service on smartphone yet. So, but again, the augmentation will happen, with the what we call secondary users in the system.
Okay, that's really helpful. Brendan, I don't know if you